Hi, my name is Sarah Colasanti, and for this learning module, I'm going to be focusing on queer misrepresentation in media. And my grounding source for this module is a peer-reviewed article called Lesbian Perceptions of Stereotypical and Sexualized Media Portrayals by Irene Anati and Laura R. Ramsey. And I'll bring it up in a moment, but the main points that I want to draw from it is how lesbians are perceived in the media, what harmful stereotypes are seen in media of lesbian women, the hypersexualization due to the male gaze, and lastly, racial diversity within perceptions um, of lesbians in pop culture. So, all of these points are important to understand while consuming popular media. And through feminist theory, specifically queer misrepresentation, it seeks to understand gender inequality to create a more just and equal society, and to just broaden the scope of queer media as a whole, making it more inclusive. So let me bring up the article. And I'm actually going to jump down to this page right here because I want to start with the history of these harmful stereotypes. And the author mentions that lesbians used to be perceived as unattractive and masculine, and their characters had this like villainous perception, and they were often used for comedic relief. And now we have this new view of lesbians as hot and desirable in media. Um, so this seems to be due to the male gaze, which in feminist theory can be described as depicting women from a heterosexual masculine perspective that presents women as sexual objects for the pleasure of the heterosexual male viewer. And the author goes on to talk about the male gaze right down here. And the author mentions how popular visual media targets male consumers' ideals of being sexually involved with two or more women at one time, which is mentioned right down here. So now I'm going to jump to a different article that offers a good example of the male gaze affecting lesbian stereotypes. And it's called This Is What a Feminist Looks Like: Dead Girls and Murderous Boys on Season 1 of Netflix's You. And so Rajava and Patrick offer a feminist analysis of the show, and they talk about how it's centered around white heteronormative masculinity. And I'm going to jump to a quote that says, Peach's queer love is obliterated, literally, by violent heteronormativity. So Peach is an antagonist of the season, and she's a closeted bisexual woman who is very villainous. And this connects to how queerness used to be perceived, as in the article that I presented before. But instead of being presented as unattractive and masculine, she's perceived as hot and desirable. So we're definitely seeing a shift in the way that women used to be perceived versus how they're being perceived now. But we're still lacking the diversity in personality between these queer women because they're definitely still being portrayed as having violent and villainous characteristics, which limits the scope of different personality traits that lesbians have. And throughout the show, Peach commits the same violent, invasive, and just inappropriate acts as the white heteronormative male does, who's the main character of the show. And he's a very loved character because of it. And she ends up as the antagonist of the season, creating a pretty big double standard between the two characters. And in the end, she actually ends up dying, which brings me to my next quote in the article. The author states only 38 lesbian or bisexual TV characters of 383 who have appeared on American television since 1976 have been permitted happy endings, while 95 have died. So now we're seeing a higher percentage of queer individuals not getting the same happy endings that heteronormative romantic relationships do. So, jumping back to the previous article, the author states the popular media's frequent portrayal of heteroflexibility may foster the relationship stereotype that lesbianism is merely an experimental phase rather than a valid relationship. And what she means here is that another stereotype of lesbianism is the idea that it's temporary and it's just a phase and it'll go away, which is extremely harmful to the queer community because it recenters queerness as something that is not definite, and that will just go away eventually, which is not true for lesbians within the queer community. And another piece of popular media that we see this in was Katy Perry's hit song, I Kissed a Girl. The author mentions it right up here. She states, uh, this marked a popular example of lesbianism being simultaneously commodified and devalued as a viable sexual orientation when Perry references kissing a girl just to try it, rather than due to actual sexual desire. In the case of lesbians portrayed on American television, the message is sent to viewers that lesbianism is in part a performance that can be enhanced for the attraction or for the attention of heterosexual men. So again, we're seeing the recentering of the heteronormative view of romantic relationships. And the last thing that I wanted to touch on within the stereotypes of lesbianism is the objectification that women seem to be subject to in pop culture. And the author does a really good job of explaining this. And she also states the objectification of women is pervasive, especially for Black women who are subject to the Jezebel stereotype, which is mentioned right down here. And this stereotype is an image that's meant to control Black women's sexuality and portrays them as sexually promiscuous. Then the author goes on to talk about how this affects women mentally, and how sexual objectification can be internalized as self-objectification, which increases body shame, anxiety about their personal experiences, and physical safety. So now we're getting this intersection between race, gender, and sexuality, and what that means for lesbian Black women. So these Black women are being dehumanized, and their bodies are being separated from who they are as a person, making them seem like they're just used for pleasure, which doesn't just have mental implications, but can be extremely harmful, um, and dangerous. So, of course, these stereotypes within the queer community, they're not limited to lesbians. We see gay men stereotypes as well. And one example of this is the gay best friend trope. And an article that's titled Why It's Time to Say Goodbye to the Gay Best Friend by Scheffler does a really good job of explaining how these stereotypes reduce LGBTQ plus characters to secondary limited roles, created solely for the purpose of supporting their straight counterparts. And in the article, the author mentions stereotypes are a classification system that makes the world feel more manageable, and people cling to them when something is unknown or threatening, which is true for all different types of stereotypes within the LGBTQ community. But in this case, for this module, it's very true for um, the lesbian stereotypes because sometimes they pose very threatening situations for men who feel threatened by same sex attractions. So, another article that I think relates really well to this topic is written by Allie Daisy King. It's called The Lack of Asexual Characters in Pop Culture is a Product of the Male Gaze. King talks about how the male gaze influences what stories are being told and limits the visibility of asexual identities. And they also talk about the lack of female asexual characters represented in the entertainment industry. They state, quote, a woman being devoid for the desire for sex is therefore an anomaly in media because the mostly straight white cishet men who run the entertainment industry don't tend to promote any identity and lifestyle that is in direct opposition to the heteronormative standards upheld by society. And the lack of representation of women who don't conform to heteronormative standards, such as those without sexual desire, people who are asexual, or even people who are aromantic, it parallels the misrepresentation that we discussed of lesbian women in media, because lesbianism is often portrayed as existing for male pleasure rather than as an authentic and valid sexual identity. So both reflect how media narratives shaped by a straight male dominated industry erase or distort identities that challenge traditional norms of femininity and heterosexuality. And that is it for my learning module. So thank you for listening.